Welcome, everybody. I'm Jody Schneider. I'm president of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, and I'd like to welcome you to our online Zoom event about covering the George Floyd protests and the growing threats to journalists who are doing so, covering the unrest in the United States. We're very lucky tonight to be joined by Joel Simon, the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists from the U.S., and Amelia Brace, a U.S. correspondent for Australia's 7 Network, coming to us from LA. So she's up very early in the morning. We appreciate that. And moderated by Eric Wishart, who is of the AFP and the first vice president of the FCC here. I'll just give you brief introductions to our journalists, and then Eric will join in conversation with them. Joel Simon has been executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists since 2006. He writes and speaks widely on press freedom issues and is the author of 3 books. Most recently, We Want to Negotiate: The Secret World of Kidnapping, Hostages, and Ransom. Before joining CPJ in 1997 as America's program coordinator, he worked for a decade as a journalist in Latin America. And we'd like to, at some day, welcome him to the FCC here in Hong Kong. Amelia Brace is the U.S. correspondent for Australia's 7 Network and has been covering the protests that erupted following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. She and her cameraman were broadcasting live from Washington's Lafayette Square near the White House on June 1st when police cleared demonstrators to allow President Trump's photo op outside St. John's Church. And she was struck by a truncheon, and her cameraman hit with a riot shield, and both were struck by rubber bullets and tear gas. This caused somewhat of an international incident, and something we'll talk about tonight. Questions are welcomed. Please submit them, and we will get them to Eric, who can ask them of the guests. So I now give you Eric Wishart and our panelists. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jody. Welcome, everybody. I would like to start with, I'd like to thank you, Amelia, for getting up for 5 o'clock in the morning in LA. That's a bit brutal, but hopefully we'll host you at a more civilized hour at the FCC in the near future. Joe, I'd like to start with you, but before we go to the main topic of discussion tonight, a case that has caused shock, consternation, amongst other emotions around the world was the guilty verdict and the 6-year prison sentences given to Maria Ressa and Ronaldo Santos of the independent Rappler news site in the Philippines on Monday. We reacted quickly to it, as you know. So this is a case with a lot of implication for press freedom and democracy worldwide, really. So, Joe, what's the CPJ's position on this? What's your reaction to it?
Well, I think, first of all, our reaction is the same as everyone else's, indignation, outrage. Maria Ressa is a personal friend, a hero to so many journalists around the world. We honored her with our most important award, the Gwen Ifill Award, which is named in honor of our former board member, an eminent figure in U.S. journalism. So she's near and dear, but beyond the sort of personal affection and admiration we all have for Maria, and beyond the reaction of CPJ, I think there's something very important that we recognize here, is that the full maximum force of the press freedom movement, if you will, is being deployed to defend Maria. So if you look at the array of forces, every media organization around the world is standing up for Maria. The media itself is rallying to her defense. She's got Amal Clooney as her defense attorney, a preeminent figure in the defense of press freedom and journalists. She is probably one of the most famous figures in journalism today. And so what we're really, we have to win. We have to win, because if we don't win, if we can't keep Maria Ressa out of prison, then every tyrant and dictator, every repressive government will feel that they can act against journalists without consequence. So much is at stake. In Maria's case, it's beyond her. She has made herself a symbol through her passion and perseverance of our entire movement. And this is an absolute Waterloo for the press freedom movement. And really, we have to throw everything we have at keeping her out of prison.
Now, I think it was 2 or 3 days afterwards, and Maria's an American citizen, right?
She is. Yes, grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. Yeah.
Yeah. It took the U.S. State Department 2 days to react, expressing their concern in a fairly short 3-sentence reaction. It wasn't from Mike Pompeo either, never mind Donald Trump. So, what do you think of the U.S. reaction?
It's pathetic. It is disheartening. And you know, Eric, I was just talking about how the full power and force of the press freedom movement is being deployed to defend Maria, but there's one very important element missing, and that is U.S. power. The U.S. is not stepping up. I mean, not just in this instance, but around the world. That has enormous consequences. In this case, this is an American citizen who is performing the most essential function of journalism, accountability journalism, with support and backing from the Filipino community in the United States, from journalists around the world. So the U.S. absence is, I think, the single most critical factor. You know, we could criticize the U.S. press freedom record, and we will in a moment. It's not that the U.S. press freedom record is perfect, but it has exerted a positive influence in standing up for press freedom and defending the rights of journalists around the world. And without that influence, which is clearly not being exercised in this instance, journalists everywhere are more vulnerable. So that statement was again disconcerting, not only from Maria's perspective, but in terms of the broader challenges we're facing to journalists around the world.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the topic tonight about the threats to the freedom of the press in America and attacks on journalists in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd. I think you've got some data to share with us. Maybe before you start, could you maybe just explain also about the work of the CPJ, because you have a presence out in Asia as well, of course. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, we're a global organization, and we've been around for you know, over 3 decades, and we're an organization of journalists. As you were mentioning, I was a journalist for many years in Latin America before I started at CPJ. Most of the people who work for us are journalists. We have people here in New York in our main office and in Washington, but really the main, you know, the people documenting the violations around the world are our correspondents and representatives. We have somebody in Bangkok, Sean Crispin, who you may, I think he's spoken at the club and does a lot of our work in Asia. But you know, the fundamental precept of CPJ is that we use the tools of journalism to defend the rights of our colleagues around the world. And what that means is we document violations committed against journalists. We examine whether there are, you know, these represent violations of press freedom, and then we disseminate that information to the local media, to the international media. We try and generate attention. We engage with the authorities who carry out these abuses. We produce special reports. We send delegations around the world to meet with those violating press freedom and confront them. So we are an organization of journalists committed to the defense of the rights of our colleagues everywhere in the world.
So you got some slides for us, I think, Joe.
Yeah. I have some slides, and bear with me while I get them up on the screen. Hopefully this will work smoothly. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, great. So let me start by talking about what the US Press Freedom Tracker, because all the data I'm about to show you comes from the Press Freedom Tracker. So there are, in the United States, there are a number of organizations that defend the rights of journalists and press freedom. Many large media organizations, for example, have a general counsel and pursue strategic litigation and stand up and speak out about violations of press freedom. There are legal groups, there are affinity groups, but the one thing that was missing at the beginning of the Trump administration was a group that was committed to case documentation. This is what CPJ does on a global level, but we didn't really feel it was appropriate for us as a global organization to focus so directly on the United States. So we worked with a number of partners who are in the world of press freedom defense to create an online database called the US Press Freedom Tracker. It's run by a different organization called the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And what we do on the tracker, you can visit it. It's a very simple website and online database. Is every single incident of press freedom, press freedom violation is documented and recorded, and then we compile the data. And we did this because—
How do you define an incident?
Define an incident. Well, we have a variety of categories, but the data I'm about to present to you is focused on attacks, physical attacks, and arrests. But we also document subpoenas, legal action, chilling statements, a variety of different kinds of incidents. And there's a very strict criteria. So the data is very solid. And we found that there was this whole public debate going on in the United States when after President Trump was elected, and he promised essentially to make it easier to sue the media and promised all sorts of threats coming down on the media, that there was no baseline. We didn't know what was the situation previously, how bad is it now, are the incidents going up? So we created this database in order to track that. And we certainly didn't anticipate that we would see an explosion of demonstrations across the United States, but we recognized that this was possible. And so now that this has occurred, we have excellent data on threats to journalists and press freedom in the context of the George Floyd protests across the United States. And let me show that to you now. First of all, that number at the bottom, 400 plus press freedom violations, that's the number of cases that have been reported to the tracker. We have not been able to document all of them because it's a meticulous, painstaking process. We talk to the journalists, we talk to the police officials, but we've received 400 plus, we're aware of 400 plus incidents so far that we're looking into. And let me take you to, since the protest started, so this is in the last 2 weeks.
That's an amazing number.
Yeah, it's an incredible number. Here's a really important data point. 80%, so there's this sense, and we'll come back to this, Eric, you've asked me about this later, that that the journalists are squeezed between the protesters and the police. The police are hostile to the press. The protesters are as well. But the data really demonstrates that 80% of the attacks are coming from the police. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. Here's some of the data. 56 arrests. 56 journalists have been arrested. 78 physical assaults. That includes the ones that were carried out against Amelia and her camera person. So at least 50 of those have been carried out by police. 49 journalists have been tear gassed. 29 have been pepper sprayed. And by the way, I should note that 3 photographers have suffered serious eye injuries. I'm going to get to the special risk that photographers face as a result of these incidents involving either rubber bullets or pepper sprays. Obviously, all of these incidents, the 27 pepper spray incidents and the 89 incidents involving rubber bullets, those were all carried out by the police. 48 incidents of equipment or newsroom damage. Okay, so just to put this in context, so we've had the tracker. We started it in year 1 of the Trump administration. So that was in 2018 was really when we started tracking. So we had 2 journalists arrested in 2020. We had 9 the year before. So these numbers are off the charts. 56, that was for the entire year. We do find that arrests correlate with protests. And this preceded the Trump administration. When you have protests in the United States, journalists are arrested. So the scale may have more to do with the amount of protests than the particular dynamics. And again, I can get into that in more detail. but we had 10 journalists arrested. These are other protests that have taken place in the United States. It's the Standing Rock protests about a pipeline in North Dakota in 2016 that preceded the Trump administration. 11 journalists arrested or detained at when there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Ferguson, Missouri, following the police killing of an unarmed Black man then. So protests and arrest of journalists go together. So let me talk a little bit about, and I don't want to go on for too long, but let me, Eric, if I have a few minutes, let me answer some questions about why I think this is happening. Mm-hmm. So the first impulse in the United States was to blame Trump and his rhetoric. I mean, obviously Trump has attacked, belittled, undermined, and denigrated journalists and the role of the press at every stage of his administration. This language is very toxic, corrosive, undermines confidence and trust in the media, empowers autocrats around the world. We've been highly critical of it. But I don't think it's the fundamental dynamic that's happening that's leading to the arrests of journalists covering protests. I think it's gasoline on the fire. I think the fundamental dynamic, and I really want to hear what Amelia has to say about this, because this is happening across the country in different cities, many cities with Democratic mayors, Democratic governors. Police are local, they report to the mayor. So I think this has to do with militarized policing, aggressive crowd control strategies that have been in place for well over a decade. The Obama administration tried to implement the Justice Department some reforms, but they were limited and they've been rolled back by the Trump administration. So he has responsibility for that. But this is a dynamic, and we can talk a little bit more about these strategies that has existed for some time. In other words, where there are protests, where there are police, there are journalists arrested. So then the other thing that people ask me, well, aren't the protesters to blame to a certain extent? And when you look back at other previous protests that we've documented, that is part of the dynamic. In other words, journalists have told me that the protesters are hostile to them. Many protesters and demonstrators now feel they want to tell their own stories. They don't trust the media. They don't want to be photographed because that puts them at risk. And so they're hostile to the media. So journalists have been dealing with hostility from protesters in previous demonstrations, but that doesn't seem to be the dynamic here, because we have data to suggest that 80% of the attacks are carried out by the police, 56 arrests of the police seem to be the primary perpetrators. And then just to get ahead of your question about the role of informal journalists, so call them bloggers, someone carrying a cell phone and saying, hey, I'm a journalist, and we recognize that that's a journalistic role. We defend the people who do that. But again, we've seen that dynamic, for example, in the protests around the Occupy movements. Police made a legitimate claim that they were having trouble figuring out who was a journalist and who wasn't, and it was a real issue. That's not the dynamic here. Again, the data suggests, and Amelia's case I think is representative, that many of the attacks are being committed against credentialed journalists who are highly visible. About a quarter of them involve photographers who are carrying cameras and other equipment that visually identifies them as journalists. And we've seen so many instances, and again, Amelia's case is typical, in which people say, the journalists say, I'm a journalist, I'm press, the police don't care, they beat them, they arrest them. So the dynamic that we've seen in other protests in which the police were genuinely having a challenging time figuring out who's a journalist and who wasn't, that does not seem to be the dynamic here. So I'll leave it at that. We have a lot to talk about, but I look forward to questions and to hearing Amelia's perspective on this.
Thanks, Joel. So Amelia, what's it like in the front, right? What's it like on the front line? And can you talk us through that experience in June the 1st?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the answer is terrifying, to be honest. So as you mentioned, I'm the US correspondent for 7 News, so 7, a commercial broadcaster in Australia. and I cover everything that's happening over here in the States and report back to Australia. I was actually live on air on the 1st of June US time, covering the protests in Lafayette Square, which is literally the park out the front of the White House, where you often see journalists doing their piece to camera and their live crosses with the beautiful backdrop of the building. We'd been for a big walk, actually. The protest really moved to the Capitol building and then back over about a 2-hour period. And we'd been back for about, I'd say, 45 minutes when a line of riot squad police blocked one end of the street. It wasn't something that was overly alarming to me, because we knew that the curfew was coming into effect at 7 p.m. and this was about 6:15. So to me, that looked like they were just preparing for the curfew. We'd been there the night before when they enforced the curfew, and they did it in that way, in that they basically made a human wall with riot police and slowly moved forward until they'd made like a human perimeter further out from the White House. So it all looked to be much the same as what had happened the night before, which we had covered for quite a few hours. So nothing about it seemed alarming to me. We then heard that Donald Trump was set to speak in the Rose Garden. So I remember I was keeping an eye on my phone, hoping to listen to that while also doing what I'm doing. And then all of a sudden, as I was doing my live cross at 1/2 the hour, that line of riot squad police just moved through without warning and incredibly quickly. And anyone in their path was really getting quite brutally cleared out of the way. And we managed to kind of jump up, and we took shelter behind a building. And we were expecting the line of police to pass and that we could then fold in behind it and then continue to cover what was happening from behind the police line. But instead, the police really turned on us, towards us. As you mentioned, my cameraman, Tim Myers, he popped a shield right to his stomach, which was quite a heavy hit. And then he was punched into the camera, which of course then pushed back into his face. At that time, we were both screaming that we were media. You can hear in the tape, we're both just saying media, media, media. That I feel like one of the officers acknowledged that finally and kind of gave us a motion to move. So we turned to move, and as we were running away from them, I got hit across the back by a police officer with a truncheon. And then because of the mayhem, we really got stuck. We were cornered. And that's when there was they're actually called pepper balls, being fired into the crowd. So I got hit from quite close range with one of those, and a few times in the legs from others that were bouncing around. And there was certainly some sort of chemical irritant used in that instance as well. Meanwhile, we're still live on air trying to report while all this is going on. And it was just terrifying, because every time you could get away, the police moved forward again in this huge rush that just left no time or space for anyone, including the media, to get out of the way. And eventually, we basically were able to get our heads down to try to get through the smoke and gas to make our way through the crowd and around a corner. But even then, we had to keep running for quite a few blocks, because the police just kept pushing forward. And some on horseback, anyone that was really getting in their path was getting very forcibly cleared out of the way. So it was a very terrifying moment, and quite a violent moment as a journalist. And then it wasn't until we'd run quite a few blocks away we realised that it was to clear the way for the president to come out to the church for that media opportunity where he posed with the Bible. So quite a surreal 45 minutes, to be honest, for it to go from that madness to moments later, there's still smoke in the air and the president's standing there, posing for a photo. It was really an amazing moment. I think in Donald Trump's presidency, I do think it's something that will be quite a defining moment.
The thing I don't understand is why the violence. I mean, they could have told you, please move, the president's coming. And I would assume if the Secret Service comes up and says, the President of the United States is about to walk through the square, can you please stand aside, you'd have done it. So why the violence? Do you have any understanding why they attacked you? Or the protesters, for that matter?
No, and that's a point I made during my crosses. Not only was there no warning, but this was early. This was half an hour before the curfew was due to come into effect. So everybody who was there, including us, had no reason to expect that to happen. So we are exempt from the curfew as credentialed media, but the protesters still had half an hour to legally be there without any reason to expect that they had to move on. And it really wasn't until after we had any idea that it was for the president to come out. So that there certainly was no warning, there was no explanation. And from what I saw, the heavy-handed approach by police was completely disproportionate in terms of any violence that they were receiving from protesters. Whereas the night before was much more, I would say, significant in terms of the behaviour of some protesters. The night before was when we saw those fires, those amazing pictures of fires out the front of the White House, and looting and smashed windows and buildings being broken into. The night before, the Sunday night, was when perhaps a response like this might at least make more sense. But this was broad daylight at the front of the White House. I saw perhaps 1 or 2 water bottles being thrown over the fence at police. That was the most significant, agitation from protesters. So for the police to then come in with that level of force was very surprising and is certainly unexpected.
You said you had credentials. This is quite a big topic of discussion in Hong Kong. I mean, as you know, we've had a lot of protests in the past year, and journalists have been in the front line, and Joel talked about the effects of rubber bullets. An Indonesian journalist, Baby Mega, lost an eye in an unprovoked attack, but shot at point blank range by a policeman with a rubber bullet that blinded on one eye, and still has not been brought to account for that, as far as I know, right, Judy? Has not been brought to account, unlike the 2 policemen who are now doing desk jobs in your situation, Amelia. But the big question, and we're going to come back to this a bit later with Joel, is that it's very important, I think, also for journalists and police to have a relationship. We have to talk. We have to, police in riot situations, which yours wasn't, at least at the start, Amelia, before everybody went in with tear gas. I think it's important for journalists to realise what police are facing, but also police have to understand what journalists are doing and what their jobs are. So we meet the Hong Kong police. The FCC has just had its second meeting with the Hong Kong police. One issue in Hong Kong is the huge number of amateur journalists, citizens journalists, whatever, bloggers who have these yellow vests to go to the protests. You can have 100 at a time. And so one solution the Hong Kong government has floated, the police have floated, is a form of official accreditation, which the journalists associations and the FCC have opposed because of the political situation in Hong Kong. We don't really want the authorities deciding who's a journalist or not. So the question is, how does it work in other countries? I work for AFP in France as a commission, which gives you a press card if you're a professional journalist, which is quite accepted, So I'm very interested, and it's very relevant for the discussion in Hong Kong. What kind of credentials do you have? You're based in LA, right?
Yes.
Working for a television news organization. What kind of credentials do you have? Do you have 25 credentials? Do you have credentials for Hollywood and for the New York police? How does it work in the US?
So I have 2 primary forms of credentials. They're the 2 that I always have on me. One is a sheriff's pass from the LA County Sheriff. So that is primarily what I would use if I was out here in the city. And obviously, that's probably what I would use with police, to say if I was at a crime scene, even in another city, because it does have that sheriff's, it's from the sheriff here in LA. I also have a State Department press ID, which is important if ever you are trying to go into the White House to do crosses from the White House lawn, or you are at any event where the president is. So even if you're at an event and your credential to be near where Air Force One's taking off, that's when you would have your State Department ID. So the day in question, I was holding my State Department ID, given the proximity to the White House and that it was more of a political event in the end. But both a photo ID, both clearly have the words press across the top. And in terms of working here in the United States, I would say prior to this incident, the respect and the access that those passes get you is quite amazing. I would suggest the access is better than back in Australia. Once you flash that press card, you get waved under the police tape, and you really do get quite close to the scene of many events. So prior to this, I would say that the credentials are very highly respected here by law enforcement.
Has there been any follow-up with you? I mean, Scott Morrison called for an investigation. Pompeo, I don't really know if it comes under the State Department, but said they would look into incidents against foreign journalists. And as I said, these two officers, I think, the last thing I read, are on desk duty. Has there been any follow-up with you officially?
Not officially. So Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, did call for our ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodinos, to make representations to the State Department and to Mike Pompeo, basically registering Australia's displeasure at our treatment. And I believe the response was that they were planning to look into it. And in terms of what the response is, I'm not sure what we can expect. Perhaps just an acknowledgement that they probably shouldn't do that. But no, as yet, we are yet to have any sort of official response from the US government.
Okay. Joe, yeah, what do you take from that experience, what Amelia and the cameraman went through?
Well, I mean, every experience is different, but there are common elements. I mean, the technique she described is sometimes called a kettling, and it's a technique that's been around for some time, but is being deployed more and more commonly in demonstrations in the United States. And what it involves is police basically surrounding the demonstrators and cutting off access, and then either pushing them out in smaller groups, or in some cases completely surrounding them and arresting everyone, which we've seen in other demonstrations who are within this confined area. And so we've seen a number of journalists arrested in those circumstances. Her account of informing the police that she's media and having credentials to demonstrate that, and that it sounds like there was one officer who responded, but many basically ignored it. That is also typical of the kinds of accounts that we've received and that we're aware of. I think honestly, the fact that Amelia was an international correspondent on live television, I think she'll acknowledge that this gave this visibility and made it into a diplomatic incident. But in many other regards, it's a typical experience that's been described to us and that's been documented through our research that journalists have experienced, basically in demonstrations across the country.
I mean, that's the case for George Floyd. How many other George Floyds were there, but it wasn't filmed. So, I mean, it was just the situation that we saw Amelia live. So I have a question from Christy Lou Stout, who is CNN anchor and member of the FCC board. She says, Amelia, thank you for sharing your harrowing experience with us. Joel, why did this happen? What policy, what rationale do you think led the police to assault Amelia and her crew? What's the mindset? I mean, this is something we look at here. I mean, why did this policeman fire it? Maybe mega point blank range with a rubber bullet and blind her in one eye. I mean, why are they doing this? Why are they seeing a clearly identified Australian, well, they might not have known that it was an Australian TV crew, but a clearly identified TV crew. Why are they attacking them? I mean, and not just once. I mean, the shield, the baton and then the pepper balls. I mean, what is the mindset here? Is it whipped up against the media, or what is the mindset?
Should I answer that, or would you like Amelia to answer that? Sorry?
Both of you, yeah.
Okay, well, Amelia, do you want to go first?
Christy,
Go ahead.
Christy,
Go first.
ask the question to you, Joe.
Oh, okay.
I guess I can't explain the mindset. The only feeling I got on the ground was that they were being completely indiscriminate. There was no care or regard for the fact that we were media. They didn't want to treat us differently to the protesters, so they didn't. And I'm not sure if that's something to do with training or whether that is an attitude, but that's certainly the feeling that I got, because even after, as you said, we were very visibly a news crew, but even after we'd screened media and some of them had acknowledged it so that they were hearing it, it was moments after that I was quite a few steps away when I got hit over the back. So it was very clear that I was a journalist who was running away from these police officers when I got hit. So there just was a little regard for the fact that we were there doing our job and had every right to be there.
Joel, the question is, what was the rationale behind it?
Well, it's very hard to say, obviously, but let me make some observations based again on the data and the research that we've carried out. First of all, I noted that, I think the dynamic here has more to do with the strategy and style of policing in the United States, which is highly militarized, and with Trump's rhetoric. This is an exception because obviously these police were, and it was a mixture of park police and Amelia, I don't remember all the different police who were out there, but this was not, just the Washington D.C. police, and they were obviously ordered. We know that, to clear the square, and this was a direct order from people close to the president. Whether it was President Trump himself or not, we don't know, but there's plenty of evidence that senior White House officials, including the Attorney General, may have actually issued the order that caused the square to be cleared. But it's the old adage, if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. This is how the police in the United States are trained, and this is not a new phenomenon. Following in the aftermath of the Gulf War, a lot of repurposed military equipment was made available to police departments across the country. So when you have demonstrations, you routinely see Humvees being deployed by local police in the street, which to me, it's been normalized, but it's to me, it's crazy. And the police are basically outfitted in militarized gear. They use very aggressive strategies. These strategies were developed following widespread protests in Seattle, when the WTO meeting took place there, and in New York around the Democratic National Convention when there were widespread protests. So again, whenever you see protests in the United States, large gatherings, particularly where there's some potential risk of violence, which I suppose we have to acknowledge was the case here, because while this was a peaceful protest, there had been some violence. This is the way the police deploy, and this is the way they respond. And what we've seen increasingly is that, and partially this may be due to a breakdown in the relationship that you described, but police used to make, it was informal, it was the norm. It wasn't codified in law, but if you were a journalist, they would show you some deference. They might even know you, because if you were a beat reporter and they were the local cops, they might even know you. And so they showed you some deference. That's gone. That's just gone. Saying on media, sometimes the police will give you, cut you some slack, but most of the time they will not. And this is the outcome.
So I read something you wrote, Joe. I think you're having there's a kind of an outreach effort at local. Could you explain that a bit? What's happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the Committee to Protect Journalists, we're a global organization, so we've been pulled into this because this is a press freedom crisis with global implications. But we don't have chapters all over the United States. That's not really the way we're structured. So we've been working with a really terrific group called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They are lawyers and they're domestically focused, and we've been joining letters that they've written to local police departments and governors and mayors outlining their concerns. We've also joined with other groups in outreach to mayors across the country. CPJ's board of directors issued an open letter to governors and mayors and police chiefs across the country. And you know, basically what we believe is difficult and as challenging as this is, there has to be outreach to local police departments. There has to be some dialogue. You know, I absolutely believe that the president has some responsibility, and his rhetoric is supremely unhelpful. But I think the only way forward is to really engage with local police departments, have a dialogue, talk about the law, pursue legal action where it's warranted, pursue accountability for police who've engaged in abuse of their authority. But there also has to be dialogue, and that's what we're looking for.
Have you covered protests since that, Amelia?
Well, I continued to work throughout that night, and then I was there for another week. So yeah, we were straight back out there the next day in that same area.
Covering. Oh, right. I think you were bruised from that. I read your interview. Shaking.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, we were straight back out there. Obviously, that's our job, is to continue to tell this story. It was actually the biggest inconvenience was quite a lot of our equipment was damaged, so we had to take some time when we should have been sleeping to try to get that back up and working, so we could make sure we could go live again the next day. But yes, we continued to cover the events right through for another week outside the White House.
Have you had training for these kinds of situations, and what kind of gear do you have to protect yourself?
I guess, have done like hostile environment training, so not specifically for, you know, well, it's not police that you normally would expect that you're worried about. In terms of equipment, we both had goggles, and our main concern was, again, any sort of non-lethal bullet, so rubber bullets or these pepper balls. And we also had masks. But in terms of our bodies, it was my backpack that really saved me, because that's, it definitely saved me from a few more of those pepper balls. And also when I got hit across the shoulders, the straps really protected me. And poor Tim just had nothing. He really got that shield straight to his stomach and then hit in the face. So he copped it a lot harder than I did.
Joe, what's the CPJ's advice? I mean, this is a concern of mine in Hong Kong. I mean, in my previous position, I was editor-in-chief for AFP for 6 years, and one of my responsibilities was over the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and we introduced mandatory hostile environment training back then. And so we have rules. If you're going to protest, if you're going to war, if you're going to disaster zone, you have the training, you have the equipment. And my concern when I see these amateur journalists, I would call them, you know, I think that sort of, I think it's a reasonable description, is that they become the eyes and ears for us on the ground as well, for you know, established media. But at the same time, I look at them in the protests here, that they don't have the gear, they don't have the training, they're too close in. So, I mean, what advice would you give to people in the United States, Hong Kong, wherever, who are going to go down and you know, they want to be the eyewitness, they want to cover it as an amateur, not as a, and it's increasingly difficult to get a full-time job with a news organization. So a way in is becoming a freelance and just taking this footage and then trying to get a job. What would you say, what advice would you give to amateur journalists going out in the field? What would you say the minimum they should do? And let's not talk about wars or Syria. Let's just talk about a protest situation. And as we've seen in the streets of Hong Kong and in the United States, what's the minimum they should do?
Well, it's a somewhat complicated question, but let me start at the beginning. CPJ, we have an emergencies department that has been putting out safety information, and we've been working very, very hard to reach into the informal networks. So not just, you know, most newsrooms, as you indicated, have safety protocols in place for their people. Those are being refined given the emerging risk of covering protests in the United States. But there are a lot of journalists out there who don't have access to this information. We're trying to provide it. And part of it is the specific training, but part of it is just a mindset. It's just a professional identity. I'm a journalist. I have responsibility as a journalist to operate within the ethical framework of the profession and to ensure my own safety and to ensure that the work that I'm doing does not endanger anyone else needlessly. And in order for that mindset to take hold, we need to bring these people into our community and support them. Now, the complicating factor is, some people, as you suggest, I started my career as a freelancer in Latin America. I'm very sympathetic to freelancers and, understand the challenges that they face. But I always had an identity as a journalist. I was out there as a journalist, even if I had a more sort of activist vision of what journalism represented. But there are a lot of people out there who are doing journalism or documenting what they are observing for public dissemination, but which is a form of journalism. I think we have to acknowledge that. They're trying to document what they're observing and share that with the public, but they don't have the professional identity of a journalist. They don't see themselves as journalists. They may see themselves even as kind of activists who are, through their activities by documenting, say, police violence or other actions taking place, are directly supporting the protests. So they're in this sort of gray area where they're not necessarily operating within the sort of ethical and professional framework of journalism, but they're performing a quasi-journalistic role, and they're really hard to reach. We think it's a legitimate role, and it's a legally protected role, and it's an important role. So I'm not in any way denigrating them or suggesting that they don't have what they're doing is not important. But it's different from journalism, and so they're harder to reach, and they can actually make the situation more dangerous for journalists, because the police are genuinely, there are instances where I think in good faith, the police don't know how to deal with all these people running around who say they're journalists. And they're very hard to kind of bring into our, professional framework. So, I don't have an easy answer for that part of the question.
Have you seen, as I said, for lack of a better description, some amateur journalists out covering these protests?
I think Amelia can speak more directly to this. I haven't actually been out there. I've just been talking to journalists who've been out there. They're out there, Eric, but they're not. The data does not suggest that they are the primary victims of these attacks. The primary victims, and this I think is really interesting, are credentialed journalists who are highly visible. So, I think this is a genuine problem, and it has been in other protests. But again, I'm basing this on the data. I haven't really analyzed it completely. But what we're seeing, at least initially, is that the journalists who are the victims of these attacks are well identified. They sometimes are able to identify themselves to the police. So I'm not sure that is the dynamic we're seeing in these recent spate of incidents.
What's your feeling in that, Amelia?
I would agree. In terms of Washington, D.C., the majority were credentialed traditional news crews, so cameramen and journalists, or snappers, photographers, and journalists. In terms of, I guess, amateur journalists, I would say more what I would see would be activism rather than journalism, in that it's people who are part of the protest documenting it. So they're using their phones, or some people did have small cameras as well, but I certainly didn't cross paths with anyone who was there impartially to document what was happening as a journalist, other than those who were there as employed, credentialed journalists. And it is interesting. There are people who are saying to us, we don't need you, we can cover this. And one woman said to me outside the White House, I've got Instagram, so we don't need you here, which is obviously very frustrating, especially after the week we'd had. But for every person that said that, there were people saying thank you for being here, and people who'd seen what had happened to us were saying thank you for coming back. So I do think there was that recognition that it was important that the media and the traditional media were there to cover this and make sure the world was seeing what was happening.
So I'd like to ask you both, the same question, but they probably apply to you slightly differently, about fake news, conspiracy theories surrounding the personal history of victims of this kind of violence. And, you know, there was all this stuff. It's a hoax because it wasn't tear gas in Lafayette Square. It was tear smoke, or I don't know. But, I mean, Joe, I'll ask Amelia first. I mean, as a journalist, you're obviously, your sources include social media. So how do you, when you're going through all what is out there online, how do you kind of figure out what is truth and what is not these days in the United States? And Joe, once Amelia answers the question, maybe can you, from the CPJ point of view, what's the kind of uptick in rumors, conspiracy theories in the current context? So Amelia, first of all, what, you know, as an Australian as well, you know, I mean, in this amazing American situation of conflicting versions of the truth, how do you cut your way through it and stand up in front of a microphone and tell the audience back home what's actually happening?
It is difficult, and it's something that's becoming more difficult. I guess in terms of Lafayette Square, it was very straightforward for me because I was there. So it's very easy to say what I'm seeing and what I'm breathing and what I'm feeling. I don't need to get another source on that because it's happening to me. So it was very interesting to hear the White House say there was no tear gas because there was something. And then they've now acknowledged that there was a chemical irritant designed to irritate the eyes. So not tear gas per se, but there was certainly some sort of a gas in the air there. It is frustrating when you are on the front line of a moment like that and report it exactly as you see and feel it. And there are, of course, people who are sitting at home on Twitter, you know, on the other side of the world, in some cases saying that didn't happen. You just think, oh, okay, well, sorry. But being there makes it a lot easier to be 100% confident in what you're saying. I find it more daunting when you're not there and you're trying to cover an event. And of course, you have to look to Twitter and Instagram and Facebook for these amateur videos because often that can be the moment that tells the story. And then you have to make sure that you're verifying those sources and cross-checking with other videos and the likes. So in terms of this incident, it was actually quite straightforward. It really was reporting. It was what I was seeing and feeling in that moment. So that made me very confident in everything that I was saying.
Joel, can people in America make sense of what's happening with all these conflicting versions of events on social media? Is there a truth, or is it just whatever people want it?
I mean, it's not just an American phenomenon. Obviously, it's a global one. I mean, I think the problem is that it's, you know, it requires so much of news consumers to sort out truth from fiction, and it requires a commitment to do that. I mean, professional journalists, that's their job. We do it every day as best we can. But to ask average citizens to carry out that function is really demanding. Is it possible? Of course, it's possible, but a lot of people are, you know, not it's not even a criticism. It's a lot of work, and they're not necessarily engaged enough to make the effort. So they are sort of passively receiving information and responding to it. So it's a very troubling environment, and it's not just in the United States, it's global. But let me make a couple of observations about the US, this moment right now in the United States. First of all, we've always had conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories have always existed. Second of all, governments have always lied. I mean, it's journalists, that's part of the job as a journalist, is to hold governments accountable. You have to be skeptical. And we know that sometimes governments and individual politicians lie, and that's something we take very seriously, ferreting out those lies. But we've never, usually the authorities themselves have some level of credibility so that they're not completely mucking up the information environment. They're saying things that are mostly true or largely true. and they're not promulgating conspiracy theories, and they're not brazenly lying. But now we have authorities, including the president, actively promulgating conspiracy theories and putting them forward. And we have a president who lies casually without, without any consideration. So that completely short circuits the media system, because for journalists, you're caught in this paradox. You either repeat the lie because it's the president of the United States after all, and what the president says is important. So in some capacity, it's news, and you have to inform the public of what the president has said, but then you become complicit in the lie. Or, of course, you can challenge the lie, which is the role of journalists, and to demonstrate where something the president might have said was false. But then you become a partisan, at least the way that the president and his allies, including in the media, are able to spin it. So you're really, journalists are in an impossible situation now. There's this raging, roiling debate within the media about whether, how we should respond. It's unresolved. But I think for the public, it's extremely confusing. It's undermining trust and confidence. And one thing we haven't even talked about is the COVID-19 pandemic. But it goes without saying that in the midst of a public health emergency, accurate, timely, credible information is absolutely essential to people's ability to make informed decisions about their own health.
Well, you actually read my mind, because I was going to say we've about 5 minutes left. So let's talk about COVID-19. Amelia, I wanted to ask you, in Hong Kong, everybody just wears a mask, and most people, it's an absolute non-issue in Hong Kong for public safety. I'm not wearing a mask, and Jodie isn't, because the situation here has calmed down. But I mean, to watch this raging debate in America about an issue of personal freedom, where it's an issue of personal responsibility to not spread it. I mean, I think it was probably misreported, because the idea here is not to spread it more than to protect yourself. But as a journalist on the ground, there's a lot of social pressure. But when I see in the United States, do you wear a mask? Don't you wear a mask? How do you do it on a daily basis out there, speaking to people? If you wear a mask, is it seen as a bad thing? Does it make you a kind of a left-winger, or do people not wear masks, or officials don't wear masks, and you feel uncomfortable because your health could be threatened? What's it actually like out covering?
It's amazing that a mask has become so political, but you're right, it has. People who do wear masks can be targeted, and again, you've called a lefty or a liberal, which is mind-boggling. And I think it comes down to, on a whole, from what I've found working here, is Americans don't like being told what to do, and it just hark back to their rights. And this is another example of that, including the stay-at-home orders. We saw protests over the stay-at-home orders, where people were going out in these big groups to protest being told to stay at home, which is just amazing. Again, it was public health message, a public health guidance. And I do think the message of it's not for yourself, you're wearing a mask to protect those around you, has been largely lost because people, I guess, just think that it's a selfish act. But I do wear a mask. If I feel a safe enough distance from someone, I might peel it back, especially with my accent. People can often struggle to understand me to begin with, so it helps if they can. It helps if they can see my mouth. But here in Los Angeles, it is an order that you wear a mask if you are outside in a public place and you can't safely social distance. But it is amazing how politicized that has been. And in terms of the president and the vice president, of course, refusing to wear masks, saying that they have nothing against them, but I guess refusing to lead by example in that way. It's been a really interesting thing to watch.
And kind of a big picture question for you, Joel, to finish with. And I've read the CPJ reports on this. What would you say about illiberal regimes, autocratic regimes, whatever you want to call them, around the world, using COVID-19 under the pretext of people spreading fake news about COVID-19 as yet another weapon to suppress freedom of speech and press freedom around the world?
Yeah, well,
Have you seen this?
yeah, we've actually, call it the COVID crackdown, and it's a global phenomenon. It is everywhere. It is in autocratic governments are doing this, democratic governments as well. And they are using the pretext of public health to impose sweeping restrictions on civil liberties and to enhance the power of the state. And this ranges from, expansion of surveillance to restrictions on assembly, to new laws restricting the dissemination of quote unquote fake news, which is something governments feel it's up to them to determine. And this is taking place in virtually every country in some form or another. So I would qualify this moment as perhaps, and I understand why people haven't paid attention to this because we're focused on the public health implications of COVID-19. But I think this is a moment in history, certainly in recent history, the only thing comparable would be, the post-September 11th, war on terror environment in which we've seen a systematic rollback in fundamental rights around the world, including press freedom. There's some legitimacy, there's some legitimate role, obviously, for governments and to impose certain kinds of restrictions to protect public health. That's not what's happening here. And I think we really need to be very, very, I'm mindful of this every day. At some point, we're going to have a vaccine, I hope, or this, for whatever combination of factors, this pandemic will recede. And I'm worried that what we'll be left with when that happens is a world in which state power is strengthened, civil liberties are weakened, accountability is reduced, and we have to be mindful that is playing out before our eyes and ensure that as we move through this crisis, our fundamental rights are protected.
Okay. Thank you. So with that, I think we've reached the end of our discussion. We could talk all night, but I would just like to finish by saying thank you. It's so important, the work that you do, Amelia. As you say, you have to be there to understand and to bear witness so the whole world saw what happened, so that the person on Twitter at the other end of the world doesn't have the truth. We saw what happened, just as we saw what happened tragically with George Floyd. And Joel, again, it's so important what you do. You have to shine light on all these cases. And Maria, she's just one of too many, I'm afraid. So both of you, just thank you again. Stay safe and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. See you in the FCC one of these days.
Hope so. Hope it soon. Be well.
Thanks.